the Leon Trotsky Revolutionary Newsletter and Podcast. I'm Connor Exum, and I'm joined by Dr. Juliet Schor of Boston College, professor of sociology and an economist. She's also the author of After the Gig, True Wealth, Plentitude, and numerous other books that discuss how we can take back our economy and change our lives. Good afternoon, Doctor.
Good afternoon. Call me Julie, please.
Okay, I will. So what I was first interested in is that this is the book that started it off for me, True Wealth. I was introduced to you by a professor that I had in college, Dr. Avery Kohlers of the University of Louisville, because I was discussing about how I felt the New Deal wasn't effective because its components were just wallpapering over our mass consumption with a new technology and not effectively addressing the underpinning framework of mass consumption itself, which, of course, this book deals with in great deal. Can you explain a little bit more about your plenitude theory?
Sure. So I had written 3 books, 3 sort of trade, more, mass-oriented books, one called The Overworked American, The Overspent American, and then one on Born to Buy, Marketing to Children. And they were all sort of books about serious problems facing our country. And I had one chapter at the end on what to do. And that chapter was always very unsatisfying. And, the people who read the books mostly found that to be true. I mean, that would be the part of the book that they would most focus on. So I decided to write a book that's sort of a vision of a different way to live in the US that sort of was focused on these issues that I'd already been writing about at work and consumption, but that was also situated very much in the moment I was writing it. And I was writing it in 2008 and 2009. The global financial crisis was just happening. We had the 2009, the Copenhagen Summit for Climate, which was an utter disaster, and it was pretty clear that we were failing to deal with climate change in a very big way, we meaning the whole global community as well as the US. And it was also the case that we had a government, the Republican governments of the 2000s. Obama was just about to come in, when I was writing this, but it was pretty clear the federal government was really not captured by Republicans, not going to be providing a solution. So I just want to say that up front, because plenitude is it's a household or individually based solution or vision that doesn't have a lot about what the government could do. And there's a lot the government can do, but I was trying to be sort of rooted in the here and now and saying, okay, your government isn't doing anything to solve these big problems. What can we get started on as we build a movement to really make fundamental change? And the plenitude vision had 4 parts. One was reductions in working hours. So people delinking from corporate jobs, which are killing them anyway, and to the extent that they could. Number 2, self-provisioning. And I was watching a movement of people more and more who were sort of doing things for themselves, bartering, building straw bale houses, growing food, kind of taking matters into their own hands, either as individuals or as groups, and saying, let's build a different kind of society. So people who were kind of trying to create the world that they want to live in the here and now, what one of my colleagues called real utopias. So here and now visions of how we could live differently. A third were new cultures of consumption, which were sort of getting out of purchasing new, creating a lot more secondary markets for the exchange of goods, because one of the things I showed in the book was we've just gone through this enormous buying spree of all these cheap imports. People are just throwing them away when they really still have a lot of functional utility. And then the 4th step was sort of community investment and kind of coming together as communities for land trusts and public banking and investing in ecological restoration and all the things that we need to do to transform the way we're living with the earth, but also with each other. So those were the four components. But I think in some ways, getting out of what I'd called earlier the insidious cycle of work and spend is probably the core.
I would say that's the core of all of your research for the last 30 years, it seems, is the work spend dichotomy.
Yeah.
And how, I mean, it's in everything from after the gig, born to buy, as you stated, overspent, overworked. Even your work that you did for the Democratic National Committee in '98, the 21st Century Sustainable Economy pamphlet, it talks about it as well. So that's an overarching theme, and you've just done a lot of research on that right now, the 4-day work week, and it's really taking off in Europe. They're looking at it seriously. Here in America, not so much.
Yes, although we're studying companies all around the world, including in the U.S. and North America and Canada. So small numbers still, but who are giving 4-day weeks with 5 days pay, but 32 hours, not like a compressed work week. Yes, Europe, we have Australasia. There's a group of companies starting in South Africa. Next month, we have another trial. We're on our 6th cohort of companies who are doing this, and we're researching the impacts.
The hard part about the 4-day work week is getting the employer on to that 32-hour but 40-hour pay scale. Now, I used to run a family business, and we did service, but I did switch over to a 4-day work week earlier on because we worked weekends. So I felt that it was only fair to have, extra time off during the week. So that was one of the things. And then I switched it over so that you could even take over 1 weekend off everyone got, even though so sometimes they only worked 3 days a week, but they still got paid 40 hours a week. I mean, that was the key, I felt. But, the pandemic, we were tied into restaurants and we kind of went out of business.
I'm sorry.
That's okay. It turns out that I'm much better at the theoretical side than the actual management side. But like I was saying, so that's the hardest part to get people, I feel, to find, because everyone says, well, why am I paying them for that extra day?
Yeah. So one thing about these trials, and they're interesting, and they wouldn't come from a Trotskyist point of view necessarily or Marxist point of view, because this group that's organizing the trials, it's called 4-Day Week Global, started actually by a businessman and his partner, and they did it at their company. But what they went into it with the idea that actually there was a lot of wasted time at the company. And so if the employees would promise to do as much work in 4 days as they were doing in 5, they would pay them for the 5 days. And it worked out very well. And it's interesting, a lot of the companies that we're working with are also finding that there's enough kind of wasted time that they can do this. But one of the things I'm always at pains to point out is, yes, there are many companies that can do this. A lot of them are in white collar work, tech, finance. We have people in a lot in PR and design and so forth, but not all workplaces are like this. And so if we're thinking about healthcare or teachers, they don't have that wasted time. So if you're going to give them the 4-day week, which they should get because they're getting burned out and stressed out and their work's been so intensified, they are doing more now in 5 than they used to be. You're going to have to hire somebody else for those 5 days. You're going to make up some of the costs because your people aren't going to quit and they're not going to burn out, and you're not going to have those healthcare costs that you do because you're burning your workers out. But what's interesting is, I mean, there are manufacturing companies that are doing this. I did a radio show recently with someone who has a specialty T-shirt company, and it's a factory kind of job where they produce T-shirts. They love it. They've gone to the 4 days. It's working really well. I've had other manufacturing companies talk to me about it, and we have a few in our trials. We have some restaurants, not many. We have a few healthcare. So it's it's not a one size fits all, but I think what's true is that there are many more businesses in uh, both the US and other economies that actually could go to this 4-day schedule if they reorganized work, thought about what they're doing that's wasting time, or meetings are a big part of it for the white
Mhm.
collar workforce. They spend inordinate amounts of time in meetings, and they cut a lot of that out, and that saves a huge amount of time. And we're really talking about finding 8 hours
Mhm.
in the week.
Yeah, yeah, that definitely is a huge problem. Meetings. I mean, obviously, also just the fact that most people burn out in 6 hours. Most studies show at a white collar job. I mean, the famous one is what Apple back in the 80s with their 90+ hour T-shirts. They found that they could have had the Mac a year and a half sooner if they cut it back to a 40-hour work week.
Fascinating. I didn't know that. Yeah, absolutely true. It's just there, if you work too many hours, your
Mm.
productivity goes down. So reducing hours can actually raise it.
Do you think that that's part of the reason why we're also seeing a productivity slide now after years of seeing productivity go through the roof?
I'm not sure about what's going on with productivity. I think it's really hard to know. Economists have not, don't have a really great handle on it. I mean, part of the issue is that so much of what we're producing in the economy is very, very hard to measure. So,
Mhm.
you know, what are these productivity statistics even telling us? And it is a little bit surprising now because historically, when you had a sort of rapid growth or a tight labor market, you would tend to have pretty high productivity. So it is surprising, and one thing that's sort of complicated with figuring out what's going on with productivity is there's so much technological innovation going on now with digital tools,
Mhm.
and a lot of them take a while to sort of optimize, to figure out how to use them best. And this is one of the things these companies are dealing with, which is that they get these new tools and they either figure out how to use them well or they don't. And part of what the 4-day week process does, the companies go through what we call a work reorganization to try and figure out what to do. And so dealing with newer technologies, whether it's communications technologies or any other new tools that they have, is a part of this. And that's an ongoing issue in the US economy. I mean, there's constant innovation with digital technology, artificial intelligence, and so forth, that's changing what's going on in workplaces. And we need a really good intentional way of dealing with that. And in the early days, we learned this from the very early days of digital technology. In the early days, we usually don't get a lot of productivity increase. It takes a while for that to kick in. So that may be another thing that's happening, because I think that pace of technological change right now is pretty intense.
All right, I'd agree with that. But we could also look at it the same way that David F. Noble looked at it in his book, Forces of Production, that maybe we're trying to use technology to solve inherent labor issues of control over who controls the labor. And that's why we're seeing the productivity slip.
That's one of my favorite books.
It is too. I
But one thing I would say about that is that there the kind of conflict that Noble was talking about, I
Mhm,
think, was more intense in the period he was looking at, which was earlier in the post-war period. Labor got really defeated,
mhm,
particularly if you're thinking about manufacturing. And so I think there's less of that kind of conflict. I mean, his, fascinating point in Forces of Production was the idea that companies choose technologies based on how much control they will give them, and they will forego better technologies that
mhm.
reduce their control. I mean, that's such a damning point about capitalism, isn't it? That we could
Yeah,
have more efficient technologies,
mhm.
which also made work more creative and interesting and better for the workers, but the capitalists, won't choose those technologies because of control. And that sort of question about control and the need of management to control versus thinking about how do we produce things in ways that are really good for everybody, not including the people with the least power in production, the line workers and so forth.
Well, that's true. I mean, it's definitely, we don't have the same antagonism between labor as we had then, but I still think the control aspect is there. My brother works at a place called Matulsa that used to be, what were they? They were Danish structures. They make Ford frames. And for the last 20 years, they've increased the amount of robots they've had. And production has steadily slipped every year with this. He's an engineer there. And it just goes down. So when he first started 20 years ago, they were making something like 2,600 frames a week. And now they can barely make 800 frames a week. They had 100 robots, welding robots, at the 20 years ago. They now have 200 or 300 robots. And he's just watched this repeatedly. He keeps on telling me that, they keep on wanting more and more automation because they don't want to hire more and more workers, and they don't want to hire skilled workers. And even though the union is very weak, they still don't want to have to give any room to them whatsoever. They want to always have that, we can replace you or we can ship you out to Mexico in a heartbeat.
It's fascinating. So what's happening is that the complementary human labor that you need with the robots is failing to keep up with the productivity of the robots, or
it's the robots are bringing down the complementary human labor. They spend more time repairing and fixing the robots than
bad robots.
Right, yeah.
Interesting.
Well, not so much bad, but the processes that were easy for humans to do, identifying faults quickly, shifting position, because of the fact that the robots need to have, such regular tolerances between each process. If there's something off in one part of manufacturing, you slow down the whole manufacturing method.
Yeah, fascinating. I mean, there's some interesting work on the gig economy where this idea that somehow platforms were going to automate everything and you wouldn't need people, and just how complementary people are for so many of these platforms. There's a very interesting sociologist at Penn named Ben Shostakofsky who wrote his dissertation on this, with a platform that had to have multiple sites of humans to kind of deal with all the issues that came up. And so I do think, that it's a fantasy to think that you can run a factory or a platform or any kind of production process just with machines.
Right. The futurist fantasy of the 1930s that Keynes wrote so glowingly about. And what was the name of that paper? Predictions for our grandchildren or something like that.
Economic possibilities for our grandchildren. Yeah.
Where we're only going to work 3 hours a week and
15.
I mean, well, 3 hours a day.
Yeah.
5 hours. Yeah. That was on the high side because he didn't want to actually estimate on it, I think, if I remember correctly. But the gig platform was supposed to do all of that. And as you point out in your book, After the Gig, right here for the audience, that, but it actually threw us backwards in time. It created a whole servant class of on-scene servants, just like in the 19th century. I mean, when I read it, I start to think that I'm watching an episode of Upstairs, Downstairs, or Downton Abbey, if you want a more modern one.
Yeah. Well, and the interest, I mean, in a way, it's even back to the 18th century, which is the putting out system, right? Piecework. Yeah. Because at least those servants in Downton Abbey and Upstairs, they were full-time. They were full-timers. These are what I think I called it in the book, slices of servants. It's for the people who can't afford a full-time servant, but you can hire a servant for, half an hour or an hour or whatever.
That was the TaskRabbit.
Yeah, exactly. Platform. Or, getting your food delivered by DoorDash or Uber Eats or so forth. That's another kind of servant relationship, right?
Yeah. Or if you're
it's made these things affordable for the middle class and not just the it was only we've evolved into a world where it's really just the wealthy who can afford servants, and now the middle class has their version of it. Of course, if we went back 100 years ago or 120 years ago, A lot of the middle class had servants too, because I mean, the middle class was more of an upper middle class and servants were much more ubiquitous. But yes, well, the other big thing about it, that shift from time-based work to piece work means that a lot of the time that people are working, they're not getting paid for. So if you're an Uber driver and you're sitting and waiting for a fare, you're not getting paid. If you're a factory worker and the robot goes down, you're still getting paid for that while you're sitting around waiting for the line to go back up. And that's a piecework, particularly for people with, I don't want to use the term low skills. I use the term generalized skills. So skills that lots of people have, like driving or cleaning, or, I mean, people are better at it than others, but you don't need to go to many years of schooling and you don't need a degree and so forth. Those more generalized skills, which are the lower wage part of the labor market, that you've really seen that degradation in the conditions of work for those people. And of course, that's what a lot of the class conflict that we're seeing here today is rooted in the service sector and the terrible conditions of work in the service sector, whether it's at a Starbucks or on a gig platform.
It's good that you mentioned Starbucks, because I wanted to bring that up. But for me, Starbucks is another whole problem because it's so easily automated now. Especially if you look in Europe, they're doing a whole lot of automation of the coffee kiosk. Is one of their, I see at least 8 or 9 companies from Europe that have automated coffee kiosks. And we have the company out in California that makes Flippy the hamburger robot that Carl's Jr. introduced. So I'm really curious how we're going to, fix that dichotomy right there.
Well, of course, Europe has a longer history of an automated service sector than the US. And I mean, most economists, myself included, would say it's because the cost of labor has been higher in Europe. And these companies can get labor so cheaply, they can fire people whenever they want. They have much less incentive to automate. But, the big thrust of my work, getting back to where we started, is if we could get a machine that flips the hamburgers and share out the benefits of that, both in terms of the reduced work time that humans need to produce what we need to produce, and where the value of that production, if it weren't just going to the top, or if people wouldn't be unemployed because of a hamburger flipping machine. We're better off if we can figure out how to use those machines in the right way and to get the right kind of social outcomes, which are much more egalitarian social outcomes. So I've never been opposed to automation. A lot of my work has been about saying, let's get shorter hours as a result of automation. It gives us the possibility to reduce everybody's hours, not to throw a bunch of people out of work.
The trade-off.
We get richer. Automation makes us richer. Let's share the fruits of that human ingenuity.
See, I'm not sold completely on that being the outcome, though. I mean, there's no reason why it couldn't be the outcome.
Yeah.
But I just think politically and socially, the notion is that, well, the company owner owns that machine, so why shouldn't he get the most value out of it?
Yeah. Well, true. I mean, and that's where we get back to issues of power and control, and who gets the fruits of economic progress, or automation. Labor-saving technical change, of course, depends a lot on the period that we're living in. So after the Second World War, it was a period in which workers were pretty powerful relative to before and after that period. They were able to get a lot of those fruits. We built that middle class and so forth. And of course, and then that all, unraveled with the neoliberal era, and people were, unions being weakened, standards of living being degraded, and so forth, the creation of more and more really bad jobs with poor working conditions and terrible pay and so forth. But I think we're in a moment, we're now coming out of the other side of that. And there are a couple of reasons for that. One is we actually have a movement in this country. We have a revitalized movement of workers who are pushing for unionization and higher wages and better working conditions. And they have a home in the Democratic Party, which has become more receptive to those things than it was in the 1980s and 90s. And number two, we have labor shortage. And labor shortage is always great for the power of workers. And it's a combination of things, but let's remember what happened after the pandemic was horrible. After the Black Death in Europe, wages soared. And you're seeing that here. I mean, we've got a lot of people out of the labor force now. It's not going to be so easy for employers to just snap their fingers and get labor surpluses like they had before. And that's always good for workers.
No, I totally agree with that. But we also have to remember that after the Black Death, they also instituted a whole lot of rules to reduce wages yet again. And that's what we have to kind of counteract, that negative pushback that'll occur.
Well, that's
what happened in 1947 with the Taft-Hartley Act.
Yeah. But workers did pretty well even after 1947.
Well, they did. But I mean, it's been that's been a big stumbling block for them.
Yeah.
I mean,
for sure.
I had a wobbly on Friday, or was it Thursday, and we talked about Taft-Hartley greatly and how it affected overall union engagement.
Yeah. And I mean, I think it was also, this was relevant for me as I was writing about working time, because it's in the US, work time stopped declining after the Second World War. And what unions were a big part of that, because they sort of turned away from it. They've been at the forefront of work time reduction for, 70 years prior to that. And it was both the weakened institutional power of labor, but also it was the conservatism of the US labor market. And that had to do with the Cold War and the sort of larger political context. And so the political context that we're in today, the fight that's going on between, an authoritarian, fascistic, white Christian nationalist movement and a multiracial, multicultural, progressive, pro-people movement, not necessarily union movement. A lot of it is, but not all of it is necessarily, really have unions at the center. That's also going to determine what happens with a lot of these questions, for sure.
Oh, I agree completely. But I still feel that we have to do more to shift so that labor has the power. And we have to create new rules and regulations for automation, because otherwise that's going to sort of slip in there if we let it go.
For sure. I mean, one of the things I'm happy about, although I think it's not nearly enough, but the AFL-CIO recently started a new initiative on digital work, because it's been really, really kind of just they've had their head in the sand. The labor movement had its head in the sand about platforms.
Lots of things.
What's that?
I said lots of things when it comes to.
But certainly on the digital platforms and their role, and so they're ramping that up finally, which is good.
I think that they didn't push hard enough for the middle management group. They gave that up almost completely, and now we're seeing unions going into companies like, what is it? Apple now has got a union at some of their stores. But even more important is Blizzard. Activision has a union now for some of their software designers. I mean, 30 years ago, you would never have seen that.
Right. Well, and also seeing these great tech workers who are organizing unions themselves. It's not the AFL-CIO doing it. These are, unions coming up within these companies, which is really great.
And it is. I mean, but still, we have to work on the automation side. I'm not a big fan of automation, as you can probably guess. I think that most of it is just designed to control the workforce, limit who you have, and then produce a cheaper product for the ones who still have funds left at the end of the day.
Yeah.
And then it rises anyway, because obviously inflation is always growing, much to everyone's chagrin. So that was another question I had about Plentitude. Do you see it as a a deflationary kind of force?
Well,
That model of economics.
it moves us away from a financially driven
Mhm.
economy and to the, I mean, if we think about the current inflation, there are,
Mhm.
it has multiple dimensions to
Oh,
it. A
sure.
lot of it, it's partly demand driven, it's supply chain driven, so it's a number of things. And it's also the case that when you run a capitalist
Mhm.
economy really fast, you tend to get price increases because everybody has power, right, in the market.
Mhm.
Um, so uh, it's not necessarily deflationary, but it's certainly not an inflationary program. It's kind of really rooted in real relations. I do think if a lot of people followed a plenitude lifestyle, it sort of pulls people out of the labor market. So it does put more upward pressure on wages, not
Mhm.
just money wages, but real wages. So in that sense, I hope it engineers a income redistribution down, um, rather than price inflation. And how much price inflation you get depends a lot on monetary policy and fiscal policy too.
Okay, because I was looking at it from the view that as you took all those people out of the economy and put them into another whole economy, a true sharing economy, not the platform sharing economy, that the wages, they wouldn't be drawing as much. People wouldn't be buying as much. They'd be reusing, redistributing that way. So you would see the prices drop and the dollar increase in its value. You could literally buy more for it, and that's where we get that deflationary effect.
Well, it is and this term is becoming more common than it was when I wrote the book. I mean, I did talk about the ideas of this in the book, but it's a
Mhm.
decelerationist program. So in that, what we call degrowth
Mhm.
today. So it is about moving off a growth trajectory and moving closer for a given population to more of a steady state kind of economy. And yes, it typically in those kinds of situations, it does reduce demand pressures. So you would think that um, you're probably not going to have a lot of price increases. But also remember something: what we're going through right now is really unusual. I mean,
Mhm.
we had basically since the '80s until the pandemic, we had almost no inflation in the United States. I mean, we had lots of
Mhm.
labor surplus. That's why that all that downward pressure on wages.
Oh, yeah.
So, the other thing about, some inflation is that inflation, like anything else, it benefits some and hurts others. And that was a moment, if you think about the post 1980 period, that was like the ascendance of finance capital. And they're the people who hate inflation because they lend money.
Mhm.
And when they get it back, they don't want it coming back in
Right.
dollars that are worth less.
Right.
Whereas working people typically do better in a time when the economy is a little more robust and their wages are going up and they're going to be doing a little bit better. Now, what we've been experiencing with, like the spike up of 10% annual inflation, and that's not good. And the food price increases are very difficult for people. So I'm not saying, oh, inflation is a great thing, but it's yet another economic um, uh, trend
Mhm.
that gives and takes away,
Mhm.
unequally and different contexts. It will harm or help different groups.
Well, I was looking at it more of a long-term picture, kind of like Keynes was that, so as you enter this plenitude model, right, we start to see people's prices, the what a living wage or standard of living starts to revert backwards in time. So, instead of being $50,000 in 1980 as middle class, in 2050, it might be 25,000. You find out that you have the same amount of buying power, the same amount of actualization of the living standard. That kind of was the long
Yeah,
term.
it's possible. I mean, I don't think we're going to have actual deflation, but what it
I
more
always had a
like,
professor that was frightened of deflation. It was his biggest fear of anything. He
Yeah.
was obsessed with it. He wrote all these
Well,
papers on
it's,
it.
and Keynes, you saw how
Mhm.
damaging it was in the 20s, and not in the
Oh yeah.
US, in Britain, but in the 30s here. Um, because then people cannot pay back all those
Mhm.
loans. I mean, capitalism works on
Yep.
debt, and they have to pay back loans that are worth so much more than they took. So, um, but yes, I think that's right. And it's also, I mean, a lot of that vision in Plentitude is about creating another economy alongside the
Mhm.
capitalist economy that's operating on different principles. It's more of a need-based economy. And I mean, this also gets us into what the government could do, particularly that vision is kind of a small scale vision. So I think about, say, municipal level provisioning of
Mhm.
basic needs for people. I mean, I think especially with the chaos that climate destabilization and ecosystem disruption and the collapse of biodiversity, these things, I mean, we see it happening around us today in California. And, depending on which month we're talking about, which part of the country is getting ravaged by extreme weather and so forth. We need the first thing we need to do is think about providing basic security for people,
Mhm.
basic physical security and basic economic security, so that people's needs are getting met. They have places to live, they have food, they have medical care,
Mhm.
they have health care, they have community. And so, I think the more we start thinking about economic policy in terms of that, rather than growth
Mhm.
and maximizing this, that, or the other, but sort of basically needs-based economic policy. That's where we have to go right now, because we are increasingly in a scary world.
Oh no, I totally agree. In fact, I think that the big problem for most leftists is that we haven't expressed enough support for alternative economic models outside. We haven't supported the co-ops. We haven't built enough of those that can siphon off funds and really start to make a change. I mean, in the 1930s, we saw a lot of that. I mean, they had a cooperative hospital system in Oklahoma, of all places. They had massive co-ops in where was it? Oh, New Orleans.
Oh,
Co-op. Yeah, there's a great book about New Orleans cooperatives that studies all of them. I mean, even in and they exist to this day, and they were more effective against Hurricane Katrina rebuilding than the model that the government took on, which was find outside sources, build up these communities, and then they flopped
yeah,
because they displaced everyone. And so, I mean, I think so. That's what drew me towards the Plentitude idea you had so much, was that okay? This is a model we can make. We can create a sharing economy. I mean, I even wrote some papers on my Substack about why are why are why are people on the lower end not sharing cars more than buying new ones? I mean, if you could carpool, right, is one aspect, but actually just jointly
yeah,
own a share. I mean, like a Toro, but for yourself.
exactly. You
Reuse
see,
that model.
Europe, they're doing more of that,
They
but
are.
Americans are. It's interesting. I did the first national random sample survey of the sharing economy back in 2014, when it was just getting,
Mhm.
you know, and one of the questions we asked, people were very positive about everything, but we asked one question, would you like to would do more sharing with others of sort of household goods and things like, I don't remember if we put cars in there, and only 36% of the population said yes.
I'm surprised it was that high in 2014. Really.
Yeah.
I mean, I would have expected like 18%, to be honest. I mean, as soon as you say like share a car or a lawnmower, which is one of your examples in True Wealth, actually,
Yeah.
people are like, well, no, I have to have my own. I mean, you have an acre of lawn. What does it matter? You mow it every other week. Just make a sign up sheet. Everyone, pay like $10 for the gas, and look at how much you've saved yourself.
The lawnmower is so fascinating culturally. When I wrote The Overspent American, the the
Mhm.
reviewer in the New York Times kind of went ballistic about the lawnmower, because I was, I had like a little throwaway line about, yeah, you need this, but do you really need like a tractor,
Mm.
your own personal tractor lawnmower that you use, whatever it was, once every 14 days. I don't remember exactly what my phrase was, but they were like, what? How can you question? It's just, there's some of these things are just such important cultural symbols. It's really hard to get people off them.
True. I mean, and that brings us to the other study, your study of commodities that you've done for such a long time. And I always notice that the same critique keeps on popping up, because I recently read this one, Do Americans Spend Too Much? And the most interesting critique in that was not what I thought was the worst, but it was from an English professor. And it was like this cult of purchasing that you were going to throw us back into the Stone Age if we didn't all buy absolutely everything. And it was accidental. Well, maybe it's not the greatest thing for the environment, but some scientists will figure that out.
Yeah.
And we haven't had a scientist. Yeah.
Yeah. Jim Twitchell. I don't know what happened to him.
Well, he was University of Florida. He probably got a good deal from the Koch brothers. They bought that university, basically.
Yeah, I think he did kind of sell out. But what's interesting is you do have a lot of younger people who are rejecting a lot of this, whether it's thrift store fashion or, furnishing their homes on Facebook Marketplace or Craigslist and part of it's just they don't have the money. And it's often a big driver for kind of making change in the consumption area, is when people don't have a choice but to sort of innovate and create new ways of getting things and having good consumer lives, even without just spending tons of money on plastic to buy stuff that's going to fall apart.
I mean, that was Ford's big innovation, right? I mean, I give my guys $5, I control their whole life, and I turn them into the consumer I want them to be.
Yeah.
I mean, and if he could have built the Model T and sold that to today, he would have. Yeah. But I mean, that always impresses me so much, that idea that people don't see that some of the consumption is completely just based on how much you have. And if you up that, then you're going to see the old levels of consumption again.
Yeah.
And I think that we have to change that.
Yeah. This is why I've seen working hours as really a linchpin, not just for people's well-being and so forth, which it is, but also for sort of getting us off this consumerist treadmill, because if we take productivity growth in the form of shorter hours of work, it means we're not constantly producing more and more and more.
No, we've traded. We took the 50% that was going to be more growth, and we put it into 50% more leisure time, which I prefer. What about, I was kind of curious about your take on how the gig platforms have, grown. Like, for example, Uber, it's been 10, 12 years now since its creation, and it has never shown a profit. It's $66 billion in debt, basically. And yet still moves.
Yeah.
Still Uber's moves forward.
It's a kind of Ponzi scheme. I mean, that's something that my old classmate, Hubert Horan, has written about since the beginning of Uber. He's a transportation economist. And the thing is that Uber doesn't have a viable business model at anything like the scale that it has, that of its ambitions and of its investors. So yeah, they came in and destroyed taxi because they had massive subsidies from venture capital. They subsidized those rides at 40% for a very long time. So now they're no longer able to put such big subsidies on. So they're doing two things. One is they're jacking up the prices. So their prices are back to what taxi were, which means the market shrinks quite dramatically, because a lot of people were taking those rides only because they were so cheap. Either they were taking rides they wouldn't take, or they would get somewhere in another way. They would drive, or they would use public transportation, or they would walk, or they would cycle, or whatever. So that the Uber's market has to shrink for them to make a profit. And they're squeezing those drivers extremely. And that's not sustainable longer term because people do have other alternatives. So they've had a hard time keeping drivers, and it's just not viable. You don't get a good viable service. So I don't know that Uber's ever going to make a profit. And it also has really high overhead. They hire tons of highly paid economists and programmers and so forth, something that taxi never had to do. And the so-called efficiencies that they had in the early days, where in the early days, they were better at reducing idle time. That's gone away. The amount of time that drivers have to spend waiting around has really increased a lot. So, that this idea that they had this logistical efficiency that was going to get to much cheaper rides, I really don't think there's that much to it.
I don't think there's anything to it, to be honest. For all the reasons you said, plus the most important reason, as they add more traffic to the roads, they defeat their own purpose.
Well, there's that too. I need to. Sorry about that.
Oh, no problem. We're informal here. That's a big problem, I think, is just the added traffic that they're adding in cities that's slowing down their efficiency so completely.
Yeah, and there's a great paper looking at what happened to traffic fatality. Well, there's number of papers on congestion, and even Uber and Lyft have done their own studies that show they've contributed to congestion. Big surprise, but traffic fatalities, a really interesting study showing that as Uber and Lyft come to a city, there was a very long decline in traffic fatalities in this country, and it's turned around now. And the introduction of Uber and Lyft is key to that. And then, of course, the pandemic
slowed it down.
People just started driving a lot faster, and a lot of people killed on the roads during the pandemic. Really horrible.
I read that the paradox of the pandemic was that we reduced traffic time so much that people decided to. I mean, what did they do? They crossed the country 3 or 4 times in like world records. People were doing it like every other month at the beginning.
We have a family friend who was killed by a speeding driver during the pandemic. It's just really horrible.
It is. So that was one thing I was going to get about Uber. But don't you think all of the gig models look that way? Is that kind of you don't think so?
It's interesting. There's sort of 2 kinds of gig models. So Uber and Lyft are basically, and the food delivery and so forth. They're just squeezing the drivers, and they're basically a pretty typical employment model of a low wage, predatory, exploitative model. But then you have others that it really is 2 people transacting, and the platform's just taking some on top of it. And that's a viable model. That's the Airbnb model. Now, there's a lot that's problematic about Airbnb. It's had a lot of bad impacts for people who don't use the service. The people who use it are, the people who rent their places, and the guests are pretty happy with it. And Airbnb has maintained they're not so greedy like Uber. The amount that they take off the top is much closer to the value that they're bringing. Etsy's another one. Now, a lot of these platforms have increased it over time. They started lower, but those are viable models where you have 2 people who come together, they choose a price, and then there's a kind of a service fee on top of it. And it's just a very different pricing model and business model than Uber, Lyft, DoorDash, etc., which is really just a low wage, squeeze the laborer model.
Okay, I see where you go with that. I thought you were going to go with the more cooperative models that have sprung up too.
Yeah, they're great. They're just not very many of them, and they're small. And yeah.
But Airbnb, the problem with Airbnb seems to be all the fact that you're just sucking up all the low rent housing in an area predominantly and converting it, like we saw during the pandemic here in Wyndham. We're a ski town. We have Ski Wyndham, and just across the way is Hunter Mountain, which is now owned by Vale Group, and this is owned by Bailey's Group. And we've seen an explosion of construction on just houses that are going to be Airbnbs.
Yeah. And in the cities, it's not new construction. They're just taking all that all those units off the rental market, squeezing out, rents go up. And my group did some papers on this where we looked at that rent gap. At the beginning, it was something like 4-to-1. You could get 4 times the revenue with an Airbnb that you could in a long-term rental. And so all these people converting. And then you have the problem of these basically hotels, right? People running these, they call them ghost hotels, and they're not following regulations. They're not, they're basically illegal. It's not just an individual renting out their place. These are big commercial entities illegally operating hotels, and so that's another problem.
Or you have in some communities, you have the micro leasing now,
which is very short periods of time.
No, it's very small rooms.
Very small rooms, yeah.
So like you have a house on a street and you rent out every room to a different client.
Yeah.
Which is sort of like the old boarding house model.
I was just going to say that's the old boarding house. But this is a lot of these things are coming back, things from the pre-World War II period when you had just a lot more poverty, inequality. These are the kinds of things that develop when you have a society that's not taking care of its people.
But a lot of things I always marvel at, like what is Amazon, but just not a really advanced catalog. I mean, people say, oh, the catalog business is dead. It's like, no, it's not. It's on your computer now. You just can take it and you shop without a phone call. You just, press a button on the screen. Yeah. I mean, it's that to me, I always marvel at that, at how easily we've slipped back in. I mean, Uber is just the grocery store. Uber Eats is just what is it? Instacart. They're just the delivery guy from the grocery store.
Yeah.
I wonder if that model,
without the protections of employment.
I mean, that's the key.
Yeah.
And it's also other problems with it. I mean, for me, Uber's problem was that they didn't really hire drivers. They were always, they were contract workers. So they were subcontractors like FedEx tried to pull that scam for decades.
Yeah.
Finally, the big case was in Boston, I think, when FedEx finally got nabbed for it.
Could be because we have
that was 2009 when they finally had to start.
Well, there was the Dynamex case but the Dynamex was a different company. But yeah, so I'm not sure. I don't know about the FedEx where it was, but Dynamex set the stage for showing that in California that Uber and Lyft were illegally hiring these people as ICs. In Massachusetts, we had a law passed in the mid-90s that made it very clear, and the AG has been suing Uber and Lyft on this.
Has it been winning? Oh, they haven't won yet, or gone to court?
No, and now we have a new AG. The AG who sued is now our governor. So we're not sure what the new AG is going to do with this suit. It's been bumping along for quite a while. She won at every, she's been doing very well at every stage. But I don't know if the new AG is going to keep going with it.
Wow, that's impressive. Well, I guess we're coming to an end, unfortunately, because I'm all out of questions.
Well, we've had a good hour.
But it was great to get you on the show. Thank you so much for doing this. I mean, you're our most prominent guest ever, so that's good. Thank you. And I would love to have you back some other time when maybe you've got another study on the 4-hour work week or whatever comes up.
Will do. Yeah. We've got new research coming out in the new year, and
that's amazing.
Well, so I can say I look forward to seeing you more on Twitter. You're very active there. It's really fun.
Yeah, I don't really like to do it. Yeah, all the ones that I think are going to be big and popular are never, but that's probably because they're too nerdy with too many screenshots of economic books, and well, I'm a philosopher by training, so I like research.
Yeah. Well, it's I really enjoy reading you and
Well,
appreciate
thank you.
talking about my work on Twitter.
Oh, well,
And
that was, yeah, I felt I had to get my audience up to snuff on it because I had read almost every book I could find in the last 2 months.
well, I appreciate it. It's really
Well,
nice. It's
thank
been
you.
really great to talk to you,
It's been great to talk to you.
and
And
we'll see each other again.
yes, that was
Take
Juliet
care.
Schor. Bye. That was Juliet Schor for us.